The night Jonas vanished did not feel like a night that belonged to their world. Isla would remember that detail for the rest of her life, not because something dramatic happened, not because there were storms or sirens or anything cinematic. It was the stillness. A kind of quiet that presses against the inside of your ears, like the world is holding its breath. Even the house seemed tense, as if the walls knew something she didn't. Isla woke around 2:17 a.m., unsure why. She wasn't a light sleeper, and Jonas never moved loudly enough to wake anyone. But something, a flicker of electricity, a subtle shift in air pressure, a distant metallic hum, pulled her from sleep. She sat up, listening. The clock on her nightstand blinked glitchily, skipping a second every few beats. She frowned, tapping it, assuming the battery had loosened. It wasn't until later that she realized nearly every clock in the house malfunctioned at that exact moment. She called Jonas's name once, softly. No answer. The house absorbed her voice like a sponge. She slipped out of bed and padded into the hallway. Jonas's door was slightly ajar, a thin blade of cool blue light slicing across the carpet. For a moment she felt relieved. He often stayed up late studying old maps, sketching ruins, or reading about civilizations most people knew only from documentaries. But the closer she got, the colder the air became. Inside his room, his lamp was on, but Jonas wasn't there. The blanket on his bed was rumpled as if he'd just risen moments earlier. His desk chair was still spinning slightly, rotating with the faintest momentum. Isla's breath hitched. She had lived with her brother her whole life, she knew the energy of his movements. This looked like someone who stood up fast. Someone startled. Someone who didn't plan on leaving for long. She whispered his name again, louder this time. Still nothing. Then she noticed something strange, the light from his lamp wasn't steady. It pulsed faintly, almost rhythmically, like a slow heartbeat. Shadows stretched and contracted in ways that didn't match the objects casting them. When Isla reached to steady the lamp, the metal felt warm, unnaturally warm, as if it had been overheating. Her eyes drifted to the floor. Footprints. Jonas's footprints. She knew the shape of his old worn socks, the soft pattern they left behind on the wooden boards. They started near the foot of the bed, moved toward the doorway, and continued into the hallway. But there was something terribly wrong. Jonas's footsteps were visible. His shadow, however, wasn't. The light stretched Isla's own shadow across the floor in a long, wavering smear, but Jonas's path had no shadow at all following it. It looked like the light had simply refused to acknowledge he existed. Her heartbeat thudded faster. She followed the prints into the hallway, calling for him now with real fear. The trail led toward the back door. The lock was undone. The air outside was colder than it should have been for early spring, a sharp, biting temperature shift that raised goosebumps instantly. For a moment, Isla stood on the threshold, scanning the yard, whispering his name like a prayer no one was answering. The yard was empty. No car started. No footsteps in the soil. No tire marks. Nothing disturbed, except the overwhelming feeling that something had just been there and slipped away before she arrived. Authorities would later write in their report that no obvious signs of struggle were present, but Isla knew that wasn't the full story. Something had happened in those few minutes between her waking up and reaching the doorway. Something subtle. Something unnatural. She returned to Jonas's room after sunrise, officers checking outside, neighbors giving confused statements, her mother crying softly at the kitchen table. Isla slipped back into the space that felt more like Jonas than any other place in the world. That was when she found it. Not under the bed, not in his backpack, not tucked between his books. It lay perfectly centered on his desk, as if deliberately placed there moments before he left, a small metallic fragment unlike anything she'd seen. It was old, undeniably old, but not rusted. Etched with geometric patterns too intricate for any tool Jonas owned. When she touched it, the fragment vibrated faintly, almost like it recognized her presence. And beneath it lay a piece of paper. A single sentence, written in Jonas's hurried handwriting, as if he didn't have time to explain more: "If I'm right, tonight won't belong to this century." Isla felt her stomach drop. Whatever had taken Jonas, or whatever he had walked into, wasn't just a disappearance. It wasn't a runaway case. It wasn't a kidnapping. It was something far older. Something the clocks had tried to warn her about. Something that broke the night open just enough for Jonas to slip through. And now, she feared, it might not let him come back. By the time Jonas disappeared, most people in town knew him as the quiet boy who liked old things, old maps, old stories, old ruins. But Isla always insisted that wasn't accurate. Jonas didn't love the past because it was gone, he loved it because, to him, it felt unfinished. The way other kids talked about the future, careers, inventions, new technologies, Jonas talked about ancient cities and forgotten eras. As if time wasn't a straight line but a loop that kept presenting new chances to those who looked closely enough. From childhood, there were signs. When he was 8, he memorized an entire antique atlas he found in a thrift store. At 10, he built a small diorama of a vanished medieval village with such detail that his teacher assumed he'd copied it from somewhere. But he hadn't. Jonas created things from a place inside him that Isla always believed was older than he was. He asked questions no child should know to ask: why do calendars repeat? Why do some places feel like they remember us? What if time isn't moving forward, but around us? Isla remembered a moment vividly, a summer afternoon when they were teenagers. Jonas showed her a map he had drawn himself, not of their town as it was, but as it used to be. He had sketched dirt roads where paved streets now lay, placed wells where modern houses stood, and added a long-destroyed watchtower on a hill overlooking the river. "How do you know where those things were?" she asked him. Jonas shrugged, not arrogantly, but simply, like someone who couldn't easily explain his instincts. "Sometimes I feel like I've been there," he said softly. "Like I remember something my body never lived." Their mother worried that Jonas was retreating too far into his imagination. Teachers thought he was gifted but socially detached. And yet, those who spent even a little time with him sensed something else, a kind of awareness that made them uncomfortable. He would pause mid-conversation, glance at something beyond the person he was speaking to, and then return as if he'd heard something they couldn't. Not voices. Not hallucinations. More like echoes of something distant. Isla never feared Jonas's oddness. She admired it. But she did fear how lonely he became because of it. His room was full of artifacts from flea markets, broken compasses, rusted keys, fragments of pottery, even a cracked lens from what might have been a century-old telescope. He collected them not for their value but because he believed objects held impressions of when they were made. Isla teased him about this once, but Jonas only smiled. "Everything remembers," he told her. "Even if we forget." As they got older, Jonas's fascination grew sharper, more focused. He began keeping notebooks, dozens of them, filled with sketches of symbols, reconstructed timelines, and theories about temporal overlap. He wrote about moments when history seemed too synchronized to be coincidence. Solar cycles repeating with eerie precision. Migratory patterns matching old trade routes. He believed humanity lived in cycles, not eras. That time wasn't linear but layered. Isla often found him awake at odd hours, staring at old documents by candlelight. When she'd ask why he didn't just use a lamp, Jonas would say, "Electric light distracts the memory." She laughed, thinking it was just another eccentric habit, but the look in his eyes suggested he wasn't fully joking. He had begun to sense patterns others didn't. Then came the notebook, the one Isla discovered after he vanished, the one that shouldn't have existed. But before that discovery, there were smaller warning signs. 2 months before Jonas disappeared, he told Isla something troubling. "I think there are places in town where time leaks," he whispered as they walked home at dusk. "Moments when the air feels thinner, like you're closer to something else." Isla brushed it off as stress or overthinking, but Jonas seemed genuinely shaken. He said he'd seen a figure dressed in outdated clothing near the riverbank, staring at the water. When he blinked, the figure was gone. Isla convinced herself he was just exhausted. School pressures. Family tension. Late-night studying. But the truth was more complicated. Jonas wasn't unraveling, he was assembling something. A pattern. A theory. One evening, just a week before he vanished, he handed Isla a loose sheet of paper. On it was a sentence that confused her: history loops and whispers before it repeats in reality. She asked him what it meant, but he shook his head. You won't believe me yet. After Jonas disappeared, Isla searched his room over and over, desperate for anything that hinted at where he went. That was when she found the notebook. Not hidden, placed neatly on his desk. The problem? The final page was dated 2 days after he went missing. The handwriting was undeniably his. The entry wasn't long. It wasn't even complete. But it was enough to freeze Isla's blood. I think I've found it. The fold. The place where the past bleeds through. If this works, I'll know the truth, whether time chooses us, or we choose it. Below the sentence, the ink trailed off mid-stroke, as if Jonas had been interrupted. As if he'd intended to write more. As if whatever happened to him, happened after he vanished. Isla stared at the date, her hands trembling. If Jonas wrote this 2 days after disappearing, then the timeline of his life didn't just stop. It bent. It shifted. And now she feared she was only beginning to understand just how far her brother had gone. In the days following Jonas's disappearance, the quiet countryside town transformed into a maze of uncertainty. Police cars lined the narrow streets, volunteers combed through woods and fields, and neighbors whispered theories over fences. But for Isla, every detail felt wrong, not wrong as in suspicious, but wrong as in out of place. As if the world itself had shifted slightly on its axis the moment Jonas vanished. The official investigation began like any other missing person case. Detective Rowan, a methodical man with a skeptical brow, led the inquiry. He interviewed neighbors, classmates, shopkeepers, anyone who might have seen Jonas in the hours before he disappeared. The strange thing? Nearly everyone had seen him, but their accounts didn't match each other, not even remotely. Mrs. Leary, the elderly woman across the street, claimed she saw Jonas walking toward the woods around 5 a.m. She insisted he moved with purpose, carrying a rolled-up paper under his arm, like a man heading somewhere he knew well. But Mr. Collins, who lived 2 houses down, swore that at exactly 5 a.m., Jonas had been standing near the riverbank, staring across the water as if waiting for someone. I checked my watch, he said firmly. Couldn't miss it. I take my morning walk the same time every day. Detective Rowan pointed out the contradiction, but both witnesses refused to budge. Their stories overlapped in time, not in location. It was impossible, unless one of them was lying. But neither had a motive, and neither had a history of misinformation. Isla listened, unsettled. Jonas wasn't 2 people. He couldn't have been in 2 places at once. And yet, both witnesses described him wearing the same clothes, a faded maroon hoodie and dark jeans. The inconsistencies didn't end there. A convenience store clerk claimed Jonas came in around 4:45 a.m. and bought a bottle of water. The timestamp on the register log confirmed the sale. But the store's security footage showed nothing. The camera recorded every customer before and after that time, but between 4:44 and 4:47 a.m., the footage glitched into static. When it resumed, the water bottle was missing from the shelf. Detective Rowan said it was likely a technical error. A corrupted file. But Isla noticed his hesitation, a brief flicker in his eyes that betrayed a deeper discomfort. Technology didn't glitch so selectively. Determined to understand, Isla retraced Jonas's steps based on available evidence. She walked the path between their house, the woods, and the riverbank. She tried to picture Jonas moving through the landscape, attempting to reconcile the contradictory accounts. That was when she found something the officers missed. Just beyond the tree line, where the soil was soft enough to record impressions, she spotted a series of faint footprints, Jonas's distinctive uneven pattern from his old shoes. They led into the woods but stopped abruptly at a clearing. Not faded. Not covered by leaves. Simply stopped. Isla crouched, tracing the final footprint with her fingertips. The edges were sharp, recently made. But there were no prints leading away. It was as if Jonas had stepped into the clearing and simply vanished. Detective Rowan later examined the site with his team. A forensic expert analyzed the soil and concluded something baffling: there's no disturbance beyond these prints. No scuffle. No additional weight. It's like he took one step and disintegrated into air. Isla flinched at the phrasing. Not because she believed he disintegrated, but because the idea felt too close to the truth Jonas might have accepted. Something had happened here, not violent, but sudden. The next anomaly emerged from Jonas's own neighborhood again. A security camera belonging to a neighbor down the street captured someone walking toward the main road around 5:03 a.m. The figure was undeniably Jonas, same height, same gait, same hoodie. But the footage created a new impossibility. The recording showed Jonas turning right at the street corner, before he ever entered the frame from the left. The moment the footage began, Jonas was already at the corner. 3 seconds later, he appeared walking into the shot from the opposite direction. Two versions, separated by the edges of the screen. Detective Rowan blamed motion blur. Isla rewound the footage dozens of times. Jonas's face was perfectly clear in both appearances. Her brother had walked out of a street he hadn't yet walked into. As the investigation intensified, digital experts were brought in. They examined timestamps from phones, security systems, and even nearby traffic lights. To their confusion, several digital clocks in town recorded brief temporal distortions, seconds repeating, frames skipping, sometimes even reversing. It wasn't widespread enough to cause alarm to the general public, but Isla overheard one analyst muttering, "This is the kind of glitch you'd expect from overlapping data streams, not reality." Overlapping. The word haunted her. One evening, as volunteers prepared for another search effort, Detective Rowan pulled Isla aside. His voice was low, cautious. "We're missing something," he admitted. "Not just evidence, something fundamental." He handed her a small USB drive. "This is the audio pulled from Jonas's phone. It was recorded 5 minutes before he vanished." Isla listened to it alone. At first, nothing but breathing, soft, controlled, like Jonas was trying not to panic. Then his whisper, "I think I found it." A rustle followed. Maybe leaves. Maybe fabric. Maybe the sound of Jonas steadying himself. Then the recording glitched. A warping distortion, as if the phone was bending underwater. And finally, a fragment of a sentence, its opening, silence. The recording ended abruptly. The final timestamp on the audio file didn't match the phone's internal clock. It was several minutes off, as if the device had momentarily lost track of time. Isla replayed the audio over and over, each time feeling dread coil tighter in her chest. Jonas didn't sound afraid. He sounded mesmerized. Like he'd witnessed something he had always believed in, finally coming to life. By the end of the week, law enforcement classified the case as a probable voluntary disappearance, suggesting Jonas left intentionally. Isla knew better. He didn't run away. He ran toward something. And whatever he found on that final morning was beginning to reshape the town's understanding of time, or shatter it. The answers were there, just beyond reach. But Isla could feel it, the truth was only beginning to surface. As the days stretched into weeks, Jonas's case drifted into an uncomfortable territory, the kind that investigators hated because it defied their training, and skeptics loved because it gave them something to dismantle. Yet the more people examined the case, the stranger it became. Evidence didn't just contradict itself, it seemed to resist being understood. Detective Rowan, usually calm and collected, grew increasingly irritable. He had handled missing persons before, even unusual ones, but Jonas's disappearance gnawed at him. He reviewed every witness statement, every digital log, every piece of physical evidence. And every time, he found something new to unsettle him. One morning, he visited the Leary residence again. The elderly woman greeted him warmly, insisting she still remembered the boy walking into the woods with a paper under his arm. As Rowan questioned her, he noticed something odd. Every time she recalled the sighting, she described Jonas with a slightly different detail, a different angle of sunlight, a different posture, a different pace. It wasn't uncommon for memory to shift, but the precision of her tone suggested she truly believed each version. Then Rowan re-interviewed Mr. Collins. His story hadn't changed at all. He repeated the exact same words, down to the same phrasing and intonation, as if reading from a script etched inside his mind. When Rowan asked whether he was absolutely certain of the time, Collins grew agitated. "I know what I saw," he snapped. "He was there. The boy was real. Your clocks are wrong. Your clocks are wrong." The phrase lodged itself in Rowan's thoughts. Meanwhile, online forums began exploding with speculation. Amateur sleuths dissected every public detail, arguing whether Jonas had staged his own disappearance, been kidnapped, suffered a mental break, or, in more fringe communities, found a temporal rift. Journalists arrived, eager to turn the mystery into headlines. They filmed outside Jonas's home, interviewed neighbors, and pressed Isla for statements she refused to give. A few conspiracy enthusiasts camped out near the woods, convinced they could detect temporal distortions. They brought equipment Isla didn't even recognize: homemade radio scanners, EMF meters, infrared sensors. One group claimed their devices recorded sudden fluctuations in magnetic fields near the clearing where Jonas's footprints ended. But when law enforcement tried to replicate the results, nothing happened. It was as though the forest revealed its secrets only to those who didn't know what they were looking for. Amid all this noise, two investigators stood out. The first was Detective Rowan, whose skepticism was starting to crack under the weight of illogical evidence. The second was Claire Duval, an independent journalist known for her methodical research and eye for hidden angles. She wasn't interested in sensationalism, she was interested in truth, even uncomfortable truth. Claire met with Isla privately. "Your brother's notebooks," she said gently. "They weren't just scribbles. He was building a timeline, or rather, questioning one." She presented photocopies of a few pages Jonas had written months before his disappearance. Sketches of spirals. Notes on seasonal anomalies. A diagram connecting solar cycles to ancient architecture. Isla felt violated. These were Jonas's private thoughts, but she couldn't deny Claire's insight. "Look at this symbol," Claire continued, pointing to a circular pattern Jonas had drawn. "This is an ancient representation of temporal recursion. Civilizations as far apart as the Olmecs and the early Celts used it. Jonas wasn't just reading history. He was charting it." Isla's throat tightened. "You're saying he predicted this?" "I'm saying," Claire replied slowly, "he may have been preparing for it." Detective Rowan, for his part, was struggling with something else entirely: corrupted evidence. 3 pieces of digital material related to Jonas's disappearance had inexplicably malfunctioned: the convenience store footage, the neighbor's camera clip, and Jonas's own phone recording. Each failure was different, but all involved some form of temporal distortion. To address this, Rowan brought in a forensic digital analyst, Dr. Mira Holt. She was meticulous, sharp, and intolerant of superstition. When she reviewed the store footage, she frowned deeply. "This isn't a normal glitch," she muttered. "Video corruption usually follows predictable patterns. This doesn't." She slowed the footage frame by frame. At 4:44 and 16 seconds a.m., the camera recorded the aisle clearly. The next frame should have been 4:44 and 17 seconds a.m. Instead, it displayed 4 hours 44 minutes and 15 seconds, repeating the previous second. Then another skip forward. Then static. Then normal footage again. It's like the timestamp is out of sync with itself, Mira whispered. Like two different clocks trying to overlap. When she examined the neighbor's clip, where Jonas appeared before he entered the frame, she paused the video and examined the metadata. The encoding suggested the file had been processed twice at two different speeds. Impossible, she said. Unless the device captured two separate moments and stitched them together. Isla felt sick. Are you saying Jonas was duplicated? She asked. Mira shook her head. No. I'm saying the camera might have captured him from two different streams. Detective Rowan exhaled sharply. Streams of what? Mira hesitated, unwilling to sound unscientific. Time, she muttered finally. Or something adjacent to it. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. But the strangest evidence came from Jonas's phone, specifically the recording captured minutes before he vanished. Mira enhanced the audio. She isolated frequencies, removed ambient interference, and reconstructed corrupted fragments. Jonas's breathing became clearer. The rustling material became identifiable as fabric brushing against branches. Then Mira uncovered something unexpected, another faint sound beneath Jonas's whisper. A soft clicking rhythm. Too slow for an insect. Too regular for wind. It almost resembled gears turning. Isla's shoulders tensed. Jonas had always spoken about ancient mechanisms, time-keeping devices long forgotten. Could he have encountered something real? But the final distortion in the audio unsettled everyone in the room. When Jonas whispered, "It's opening," the waveform fractured. Not in a linear fashion, like typical corruption, but in a pattern Mira had only seen once before, in recordings exposed to extremely high electromagnetic surges. It looks almost like interference from a field, Mira said. Not the kind generated by power lines. Something stronger. Something pulse-based. Detective Rowan rubbed his temples. You're telling me my missing person walked into a magnetic anomaly that ate him? No, Mira corrected. He walked towards something that changed how the device experienced time. Isla's skin prickled. Everything Jonas had believed, the loops, the ruptures, the clues, suddenly seemed less theoretical and more like warnings. As investigators debated possibilities, skeptics intruded. Internet commentators mocked the case, claiming Isla was manipulating evidence to create a paranormal narrative. Others blamed the police for incompetence. A few accused Jonas of orchestrating his own disappearance to become famous posthumously. None of them knew Jonas. None of them understood him. Isla refused interviews. Not out of fear, but because she realized something crucial: the investigation wasn't equipped to find Jonas. Not anymore. Their tools, cameras, timestamps, analysis software, weren't built to comprehend events that broke the rules they relied on. Late one night, Isla overheard Rowan speaking quietly on the phone outside her home. His voice trembled, something she'd never heard before. We're losing the timeline, he said. The evidence doesn't line up. The clocks don't match. Holt thinks the environment was compromised. But compromised by what? We can't file a report saying reality glitched. A pause. No, he whispered. I don't think he's dead. I think he crossed into something. Isla stepped back into the shadows, heart pounding. The official investigation was failing, not from lack of effort, but from confronting something beyond comprehension. Something Jonas had spent years preparing for. And every contradiction, every glitch, every distorted frame seemed to be pointing to one chilling truth: Jonas hadn't just disappeared. He had stepped into a place where evidence couldn't follow. A place beyond the reach of investigators, skeptics, or even time itself. And Isla knew she was the only one willing to follow him there. Isla waited until the investigators left before she finally locked herself in Jonas's room with his notebooks, the one place in the house that still felt like he might walk back in at any moment. The scent of old paper lingered in the air, mixed with the faint metallic tang of the artifact she had found earlier. His desk was covered in organized chaos, sketches, maps, equations, strings of dates, and strange cyclical diagrams that resembled spirals folding into themselves. Jonas's handwriting was everywhere, looping, rushed, emotional. Alive. But the notebook that mattered most was the one dated after he disappeared. Its cover was plain, worn, and slightly warped as if exposed to moisture or heat. When Isla opened it, she felt a chill ripple up her arm, as though the paper held a temperature of its own. She forced herself not to hesitate. This was her brother's voice, his last traces, and she would read every word. The first pages were familiar, observations about historical architecture, notes on seasonal cycles, and reflections on how civilizations often collapsed at the height of their knowledge. But then the tone shifted. Jonas wrote not like a student documenting theories, but like a traveler chronicling discoveries. He described dreams, vivid, recurring dreams of pathways lit by dim, flickering suns, of stone archways carved with symbols he somehow recognized, and of a wind that didn't feel like wind at all but like memories brushing past him. "I think the past is waking up," he wrote. "I can feel it at the edges of my mind." Isla swallowed hard. He hadn't told her about these dreams. She turned the page. Jonas had drawn a symbol repeatedly, a circle intersected by a vertical line, split into two halves, one shaded, one empty. Beneath it he wrote, "The fold is not a place. It is a moment in structure. A seam in the fabric, where two cycles cross." Isla didn't understand it, but the conviction in his writing unnerved her. This wasn't speculation. It was certainty. Jonas began to describe specific locations in town where he sensed dimensional thinning. The old well near the abandoned mill. The tree line behind the school. The riverbank where Mr. Collins claimed to have seen him. Each entry captured a moment when Jonas felt slightly displaced, as if his senses lagged behind reality by a fraction of a second. Light would bend strangely. Shadows would shift. The air would pulse with warm and cold bursts. He wrote, "It feels like stepping into a room where someone was just standing. The world hasn't reset yet." Isla clenched her jaw. These weren't delusions. They matched anomalies investigators had dismissed, glitches in footage, distorted timestamps, contradictory witness accounts. Jonas wasn't spiraling. He was documenting events that others were experiencing without realizing. Then she reached a page that stopped her breath. Jonas had drawn a rough map of their town, but not as it was now. Landmarks were missing. Roads were shorter. The river was narrower. In the margin he'd scribbled, "Overlay with 1743 map, alignment holds." The same year scribbled on the artifact. The same year mentioned in the old diary Claire had shown her. Jonas had been comparing the modern town to its centuries-old blueprint. And the alignment wasn't coincidence, it was intentional. The further Isla read, the clearer Jonas's pattern became. He wasn't simply mapping physical geography, he was mapping temporal resonance points, locations where history repeated with uncanny precision. He wrote about recurrence fields, places where the present faintly echoed the past. One entry chilled her, "There are nights when footsteps do not match the hour. I have heard voices that do not belong to this century, not ghosts, but echoes from a parallel moment." Isla felt tears burn behind her eyes. How terrified he must have been. Or worse, how fascinated. She turned another page, and her breath caught. A detailed sketch of an archway made of interlocking stones, with an inscription carved across the top in an indecipherable language. Under it, Jonas wrote, "The threshold appears only when both eras align. A seasonal shift, a lunar match, temperature drop followed by electromagnetic surge. The equation repeats every few centuries. She touched the drawing lightly. His pencil strokes were frantic but precise. Then she found the most important entry, the one dated 2 days after his disappearance. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste, yet filled with adrenaline. I made contact. The fold is real. It opened near the woods, right where the clearing narrows into the ridgeline. The air vibrated like struck metal. I saw the archway from my dreams. It wasn't fully formed, flickering, unstable, but enough for me to step close. Isla's hands trembled as she continued. There were voices. Not human, not divine, just layered echoes. Some ahead of me, some behind. They overlapped like two melodies played at once. I felt pulled, not backward or forward, but sideways. Into a time that wasn't mine. He described a sensation of weightlessness, then heaviness, then a sudden clarity, as if he could hear the world breathing around him. I think I'm between cycles. He went on, the past is not gone. It's adjacent, like a neighboring room separated by a thin wall of seconds. Isla felt something shift inside her. Relief. Horror. Recognition. Then she reached the note that shattered her. If I can step through again, I believe I'll find the era where the arch truly belongs, 1743. I am close. Too close to stop now. Below it, a final, incomplete line. If Isla reads this. I'm sorry. But you'll understand soon. Time chose me. The ink trailed off as though the pen froze mid-motion. The page ended abruptly. Jonas hadn't left willingly, but he also hadn't fought whatever called him. He had followed a path he believed he was meant to trace, a path between centuries. Isla closed the notebook, pressing it to her chest as the room blurred with tears. Jonas hadn't been confused. He hadn't been reckless. He had been certain, dangerously certain, that the world held cracks between eras, and that he could slip through them. But the part that haunted Isla most wasn't the mention of 1743. It was the line, time chose me. What did that mean? Why Jonas? And if time had chosen him, what had it chosen him for? The answer felt dangerously close, hidden within these pages and the fragment lying silently on his desk. Jonas had mapped the thresholds, decoded the patterns, followed the loop. And now, piece by piece, Isla realized she would have to walk the same path, even if it meant stepping into the fractures of time Jonas had disappeared into. Because the journal wasn't just his record. It was a guide. And its final pages weren't an ending. They were an invitation. The deeper Isla went into Jonas's notes, the more she realized that his disappearance wasn't just tied to him, it was tied to the town itself. Their home, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, carried a forgotten weight. The kind that lingered in the soil, in the wind, in the quiet corners where no one ever looked long enough to notice. Jonas hadn't chosen the town for his theories. The town had chosen him. Isla began her search with local records, expecting dusty archives and benign reports of settlers, agriculture, maybe a flood or two. Instead, she found gaps, conspicuous blanks where information should have been. Entire decades condensed into a sentence. Other years documented in obsessive detail by unnamed writers. It was as though the town's recorded memory had been rewritten over and over, the way someone overwrites a tape that still faintly echoes the original audio underneath. She visited the Historical Society next, forcing herself to speak with the aging curator, Mr. Harlan. He was a thin man with trembling hands and pale, watery eyes that seemed to look through, not at, whoever stood before him. When Isla told him she was Jonas's sister, his expression shifted subtly. Not pity. Recognition. Like he'd expected her eventually. You've seen them, then, he murmured. Isla froze. Seen what? Harlan swallowed, glanced around the empty room, then leaned forward. The places where time folds. Your brother asked the same questions. Isla's skin prickled. She hadn't said anything about time. She hadn't said anything about folds. What did you tell him? She whispered. Harlan squeezed his eyes shut, as though remembering something painful. That this town was built on a crossroads much older than its roads. Much older than its people. His voice became a rasp. This place, it remembers. Even when we try to forget. He led her to a locked cabinet and removed a brittle leather-bound journal from the 18th century. The pages were yellowed, some flaking at the edges. On the inside cover was a name written in faded ink, Elias Markham, 1743. Isla's heart lurched. She turned the pages slowly, afraid they would crumble under her touch. The diary contained mundane entries about crop cycles, weather, and trade. But scattered between them were disturbing notes, accounts of travelers disappearing without explanation, stories of strange lights hovering along the ridgeline, shadows that lingered after their owners walked away. Elias wrote about people appearing in town with no recollection of how they arrived, wearing clothes stitched with patterns no local tailor recognized. Then Isla reached the entry dated September 1743. He described a boy who materialized near the river, startled and wild. The boy's clothing was unlike anything from their era. His shoes were soft and flattened, his jacket made of a material that felt like woven clouds. When questioned, the boy claimed he came from a place called Redwood County, and that he'd been walking home when the air rippled. Elias wrote that the boy's accent was familiar yet foreign, his words sharp with fear. The boy vanished again by morning. Isla's fingers trembled. This story, centuries old, mirrored modern accounts of Jonas's disappearance almost exactly. A boy appearing in the wrong time. Clothes that didn't match the era. Confusion. Absence. A slip between centuries. She closed the journal, her pulse hammering in her throat. Why didn't anyone talk about this? She demanded. Harlan sighed. Because the town forgets to remember. And remembers what it shouldn't. Isla stared at him. That doesn't make sense. It will, he said. When you see the shift. He explained it the way Jonas had written about it, a phenomenon the town's earliest settlers documented repeatedly. Once every few centuries, cycles of time brushed against each other. Erosion patterns reversed. Stars appeared brighter. Shadows elongated unnaturally. And for a few moments, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, eras bled into each other. Most people never notice, Harlan said. Our minds fill in the blanks. But sensitives, those with an ear for history, they feel the fracture. Jonas had been sensitive. Isla realized that now. But Harlan wasn't finished. He brought out maps layered on top of each other, one from 1740, another from 1912, then 1960, then present day. Isla gasped. Each map, despite representing different centuries, shared landmarks that should not have remained unchanged. A bend in the river that had supposedly shifted. A hill that geological surveys insisted eroded decades ago. A narrow path that appeared in all four maps, even though modern satellite images claimed no such path existed. The town wasn't aging naturally. It was cycling. Repeating its shape across eras like a recurring dream. Later that evening, Isla walked through the town with new eyes. She noticed details she'd never questioned before, the way certain streets curved unnaturally, as if avoiding something invisible, the way old houses faced angles that seemed misaligned with the sun, the way air felt warmer in some patches, cooler in others, with no wind to explain the change. She visited the abandoned mill Jonas had written about. The building groaned in the wind as if sighing under the pressure of time. She placed her hand on the stone wall, and felt a subtle vibration. Not mechanical. Not electrical. Temporal. Isla stumbled back, breath sharp. She then followed Jonas's notes to the old well behind the mill. Moss clung to the stones, and the wood cover was rotting. But when she leaned over the opening, a shock ran through her. There was no water. Only darkness. A deep, unnatural stillness that pulled at her senses. Jonas had written, "This well remembers. It resonates with fractures. A passage once opened here." Isla's pulse thudded against her ribs. Had Jonas found one of these fractures? Had he stepped into a moment where the town's past overlapped with its present? Her next stop was the riverbank, the place where two witnesses swore they had seen Jonas from two different angles. The sun was low, reflecting on the water. At first, nothing seemed odd. Then she saw it, her own reflection rippling in the water, but not matching her movements perfectly. A half-second delay. A hesitation. Or perhaps, a memory of where she had been a moment before. Isla jolted back. This wasn't normal. And it wasn't her imagination. Back home, she opened Jonas's notebook again, turning to his descriptions of the town as a temporal threshold. He wrote about patterns repeating, disappearances in 1743, again in 1912, and again in small numbers throughout the decades. Always in cycles. Always near specific landmarks. The town isn't a place, Jonas wrote. It's a hinge. A hinge between eras. A connector. A seam. The maps suddenly made sense. The diary entries made sense. The glitches made sense. Jonas hadn't stumbled into something accidental, he had walked straight into the center of a centuries-old phenomenon the town had quietly endured, ignored, and forgotten. Isla felt the weight of the revelation settle heavily in her chest. Everything Jonas had believed was connected, the patterns, the symbols, the fractures, the dreams. He wasn't unraveling. He was perceiving something the town had been whispering for generations. But the final confirmation came the next morning, when Claire Duval arrived at Isla's door holding a document so old and fragile it had been wrapped in protective film. "We found another diary," Claire said breathlessly. "Not from a settler. From a traveler." Isla's stomach twisted. "A traveler from where?" "Not where," Claire whispered. "When?" She handed the diary to Isla. The ink was faded, the handwriting elegant. The date at the top read, October, 1743. The first line made Isla's blood run cold. "A boy appeared near the path today. He spoke strangely, dressed strangely, and he called out for someone named Isla." Isla's hands shook. This wasn't just the town remembering. It was calling. It had taken Jonas. And now, she feared, it was beginning to reach for her too. Isla didn't sleep the night she read the 1743 diary entry that mentioned her name. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind looping through every impossible thread Jonas had followed before he vanished. The town's history wasn't just converging with the present, it was pulling on her, tugging gently but insistently, the way a tide pulls at someone standing ankle-deep in the water. And she knew, with a clarity that felt ancient, that she had to retrace Jonas's final steps. Not with hope, not with denial, but with understanding. At dawn, she packed a bag lightly. A flashlight. A recorder. Jonas's notebook. And the metallic fragment she found on his desk, its etched patterns faintly warm against her palm even at sunrise. She didn't tell Claire, Rowan, or even her mother where she was going. This wasn't something she could explain in a way they would accept, or survive. Some paths had to be walked alone, and this one had already begun pulling her in the moment Jonas disappeared. She left the house quietly, stepping onto the dew-damp grass. Birds chattered overhead, but their chirps seemed delayed by fractions of a second, echoing just slightly off-beat. Isla forced herself to breathe steadily. She was beginning to sense the fractures the way Jonas had, subtle shifts in rhythm, patches of unnatural quiet, temperature changes that didn't match the rising sun. The woods were waiting. She entered at the narrow trail behind the mill, the same place Jonas had visited repeatedly according to his notes. Trees towered above her, their branches interlocking like the ribs of an enormous, ancient structure. Everything felt heavy with memory, not hers, but something older. The deeper she walked, the more the air thickened. Sounds dulled. Her footsteps seemed too loud, too sharp against the muted forest floor. Halfway down the trail, she felt the first shift. The breeze stopped. Completely. The stillness wasn't quiet, it was unnatural, the kind that occurs when the world is listening rather than resting. Isla took another step. The sunlight dimmed as if a cloud had passed, though the sky was empty. She touched a nearby tree trunk. The bark vibrated faintly beneath her fingers, a soft hum like a tuning fork settling into resonance. Jonas wrote about this. The first sign is silence. The second is pressure. The third is time stuttering. Isla pressed forward. As she reached the clearing, the same clearing where Jonas's footprints had ended, the air grew colder. Not sharply, but gradually, like walking into a deep cellar. Her breath misted faintly even though the temperature shouldn't have allowed it. Something in the clearing felt hollow, too open, as if it hadn't been made by natural erosion but by something shifting through the land itself. Her footsteps slowed. The clearing was exactly as investigators had left it, untouched, barren, impossibly still. But Jonas hadn't stepped into the soil and vanished by chance. He had been drawn by something he saw. Or felt. Isla opened his notebook to the sketch of the archway, a structure of interlocked stones with a strange, layered inscription carved across its top. According to his notes, this arch wasn't a physical relic. It appeared only when conditions aligned, when two eras overlapped in resonance. She walked toward the center of the clearing. The moment she stood where Jonas had taken his final step, the world shifted. A sharp ringing sound, metallic, vibrating, rippled outward from beneath her feet. The light flickered. Shadows stretched, twisting at unnatural angles. The ground trembled, not violently, but subtly, like the earth beneath her was expanding and contracting in slow, deliberate breaths. The metallic fragment in her pocket began to pulse with heat. Isla's heartbeat thundered. She looked around, but the forest no longer looked normal. The colors deepened, greens becoming darker, browns becoming nearly black. The trees wavered like she was seeing them underwater. The air thickened again. Then she heard it. A voice. Faint. Echoing. Distant, but unmistakably familiar. Isla, Jonas. Her breath caught. She spun toward the sound, adrenaline flooding her body. The world warped again, the edges of her vision bending inward before snapping back into place. She heard him again, clearer this time. Isla, follow, he sounded terrified. Or desperate. Or both. She stumbled forward instinctively, toward the origin of the voice. But every time she made a step, the voice shifted direction, as if bouncing between layers of reality. Sometimes ahead of her. Sometimes to her left. Sometimes behind. Time wasn't behaving normally here. Then, abruptly, something flickered in front of her, a ripple in the air, like heat rising off asphalt but colder, sharper, threaded with faint blue light. The ripple widened, stretched, and took shape. Alya froze. The archway from Jonas's drawings materialized, not fully, but partially, flickering between existence and non-existence. Half of it appeared as solid stone, ancient and weathered. The other half shimmered like a translucent memory, its edges dissolving into the air. The inscriptions along its curve glowed faintly, pulsing in the same rhythm as the fragment in her pocket. Jonas had seen this. He had stood exactly where she stood now. Alya stepped closer. The air around the arch buzzed with an electrical tension that made her skin prickle. The temperature plummeted. Her breath fogged. The ground beneath her rumbled gently, like something beneath it was shifting into alignment. She reached out a tentative hand toward the arch. The moment her fingertips crossed the threshold, the world split. Not visually, not at first, but sonically. A cascading chorus of overlapping whispers filled her ears. Some were fragments of conversations she remembered. Others were voices she had never heard. A child laughing. A man shouting. A woman crying. Footsteps running. Hooves striking cobblestone. Waves crashing. Leaves rustling. Two eras. Moving at once. Her vision blurred for a flash. When it cleared, she saw something that made her knees go weak. A figure standing just beyond the shimmering arch, tall. Thin. Wearing familiar clothes, maroon hoodie, dark jeans. Jonas. He looked older and younger at the same time, as if time had touched him unevenly. His face flickered between expressions, hopeful, frightened, relieved, resigned. His hand lifted slowly, reaching toward her. Alya's throat tightened. Jonas. Jonas, I'm here. But when she stepped toward him, he stepped back, not by choice, but as though pulled by an invisible current. Isla, his voice fractured mid-syllable, broken into two overlapping tones. You shouldn't, the arch pulsed violently. The blue light surged, bright enough to force her eyes shut. The ground shook harder. The air roared like a storm trapped inside a cave. The whispers became a deafening chorus of layered moments colliding. Isla felt herself being pulled forward, not physically, but gravitationally, as though her very existence was being threaded into the seam of time. She reached out for Jonas. He reached back. Their fingertips brushed. A spark, not of electricity, but memory, jolted through her. She saw flashes of images that weren't hers, cobbled streets, lantern-lit villages, a sky filled with stars she didn't recognize, strange mechanical structures turning like celestial instruments. Jonas had seen these places. Jonas had walked through them. But before she could pull him toward her, the arch convulsed violently, splitting into two overlapping frames, one brighter, one darker. Jonas's voice broke through the chaos, desperate, Isla, don't step, his final word fractured, swallowed by the trembling threshold. Before she could react, something reached out from the shimmering divide. Not Jonas. Something else. A shape without a shape, a presence without a face, extending through the vibrating light. It brushed Isla's arm, cold, impossibly cold, and every memory she'd ever lived flickered like a shuffled deck of cards. She staggered back, gasping, clutching her chest. The arch pulsed one final time. And then everything went silent. The archway dimmed, flickered once, and vanished. Isla collapsed to her knees, breath trembling, heart pounding, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't imagining anything. She wasn't misinterpreting clues. She hadn't followed a delusion. Jonas was alive. And he was trapped between cycles. But something else lived there too. Something that reached for her. Something that recognized her. And now Isla understood the truth Jonas had sensed long before she did, the fold wasn't just a doorway. It was a path. And once you stepped close enough to hear it whisper, it started whispering back. Isla didn't leave the woods for a long time after the archway vanished. She sat on the cold ground, her breathing uneven, her mind looping through every impossible detail she had just witnessed. Jonas was alive, she had seen him, reached for him, felt the spark of memory that wasn't hers. But the terror of that other presence, that shape that touched her, lingered beneath her skin like a bruise on reality itself. When she finally stood, her legs trembled, and the air around her felt heavier than before, as if the forest now recognized her in the same way the archway had. Back home, she locked the door and went directly to Jonas's notebooks. The pages felt different now, more urgent, more literal. She flipped to the sections where Jonas detailed cross-cyclical messaging, a concept she had previously dismissed as metaphorical or poetic. But nothing about this investigation was metaphor anymore. He had believed, truly believed, that communication across eras was possible. Not through language, but through resonance, patterns repeating through time, leaving artifacts like footprints on overlapping sand. One line stood out: if cycles overlap, messages can echo. Time remembers what ink forgets. Isla ran her fingers over the sentence. Jonas wasn't talking about ordinary writing. He hinted at messages sent through patterns, symbols etched into objects, numbers hidden in star alignments, shadows shaped intentionally. He had been building a language not bound by centuries, but by recurrence. She pulled out the metallic fragment. It shimmered faintly under the lamp, its etched geometric patterns glinting like a miniature star map. She turned it slowly, realizing for the first time that the symbols weren't decorative, they were directional. They corresponded to some kind of cycle. A loop. A rhythm. A message. As she angled the fragment toward the notebook sketch of the archway, she gasped. The fragment's pattern aligned perfectly with a symbol Jonas had drawn weeks before his disappearance, a swirling double spiral he labeled the echo vector. Her pulse quickened. Jonas had known this fragment belonged to the fold. But how had he found it before crossing over? Did someone from the other era send it? Had Jonas left it intentionally, knowing Isla would follow? Before she could dig deeper, there was a knock on her door, frantic, uneven. Isla froze. When she opened it, Claire Duval burst in, disheveled and clutching a stack of papers. "You need to see this," Claire said, breathless. Isla ushered her inside. Claire spread the documents across the table, photocopies of letters, partial translations, scanned images of carvings from ancient structures found in Europe, Asia, and South America. All different cultures. All different eras. But each contained a version of the same symbol. The spiral intersected by a vertical line. Jonas's symbol. The symbol of the fold. "These are centuries apart," Claire said, voice trembling. "Yet the markings are nearly identical. And look at this." She handed Isla a printed image of a stone tablet excavated in the early 1900s. The carving depicted a figure stepping through an archway into a distorted landscape. Beneath it, the inscription translated to, "Those who walk between eras carry echoes with them." Isla felt a chill crawl across her skin. Jonas hadn't discovered a secret, he'd joined a lineage. "And there's more," Claire added, pulling out another document. "I found a warehouse where old artifacts from the Historical Society were stored. One of the crates contained an item catalogued decades ago but never displayed publicly." She laid out a small photograph of an object dusted with age, a shard of pottery with a line of text etched around its curve. The characters were archaic, but beneath them, in faded ink, a translation note had been scrawled by an earlier historian. Alya read aloud, "When the sky fractures and the shadows lag, the messenger walks." "Messenger?" Isla whispered. Claire nodded slowly. Some cultures believed certain individuals were chosen to traverse eras, to witness, to warn, to record. They called them messengers because time used them to carry signals forward or backward. Isla stared at the photo, hands trembling. Messenger. Jonas had written something similar in his notebook, "Time chooses its travelers." Isla swallowed a knot of fear. Was Jonas one of these messengers? Someone selected, or compelled, to walk through the fold. And, Claire continued, they believed the messenger could leave traces across time, objects, writings, or impressions that would appear in multiple eras. "Like the diary from 1743, Isla whispered. "The boy calling my name." "Exactly." Isla closed her eyes. Jonas wasn't just lost. He was communicating. She turned back to the fragment and the notebook. Jonas's notes about temporal echoes came into focus. He theorized that certain events repeated in cycles, and if one understood the pattern, they could insert a message at a point where two cycles touched. That message would then reverberate into the adjacent era. Artifacts could do it. Markings. Even sound. Isla remembered the audio from Jonas's phone, the metallic clicking beneath his whisper. You said it sounded like gears, Isla murmured. Claire frowned. What do you mean? Isla replayed the audio from memory. The clicking wasn't random. It was rhythmic. Steady. Purposeful. A pattern. A code. Jonas had been communicating with someone, or something, on the other side of the fold. And the fold had answered. Feeling a sudden surge of urgency, Isla grabbed Jonas's notebook and flipped to the pages he labeled field test, messaging attempts. He had written about sending signals by arranging stones in patterns, placing metal rods in geometric lines, even leaving chalk markings on tree trunks near resonance points. He wrote, if the fold opens when cycles align, the message will be carried forward. The pattern will imprint on the next era's materials. Isla's breath caught. Claire, she said slowly, what if the artifacts you found, pottery, carvings, symbols, aren't ancient culture? What if they're messages? Claire didn't answer. Her expression was enough. Isla spread Jonas's notes, the fragment, and Claire's documents across the table. Viewed together, a larger pattern emerged. The symbols repeated across centuries, not because cultures shared knowledge, but because someone had carried the pattern between eras. Jonas hadn't been the first messenger. But he might be the only one with someone searching for him. Then Isla noticed something she hadn't before. At the bottom of one of Jonas's diagrams was a tiny inscription, barely legible, coordinates shift. Pattern stays. Look where shadows hesitate. Her breath caught. Shadows that lagged. She had seen this at the riverbank, her reflection moving a half-second late. That was a messaging point. A resonance zone. Jonas had left clues not just in notebooks, but in the world itself. And he was still sending them. Claire, Isla whispered, voice trembling with realization, Jonas isn't trapped. He's trying to guide me. Claire looked at her, eyes wide. Guide you where? Isla turned toward the window, where the sinking sun cast long shadows across the street. Shadows that stretched, hesitated, and then aligned in a faint spiral shape on the pavement. To the fold. To the next opening. To him. Isla felt her pulse steady, not with fear, but with purpose. Jonas was alive. Jonas was leaving messages. And now, for the first time since he vanished, she knew where to look next. She gathered the notebooks, held the fragment firmly, and whispered into the quiet room, not to Claire, not to herself, but to the echo she hoped could still hear her across centuries, I'm following, Jonas. I'm coming. Isla reached the clearing just before dusk, following the spiral-shaped hesitation in the shadows Jonas had hinted at. The forest seemed different this time, not hostile, not welcoming, but watchful, as though every branch and stone recognized the steps she was taking. The air carried that same subtle pressure she had felt before, like a storm gathering inside the earth rather than the sky. She clutched the metallic fragment tightly. It pulsed faintly, almost syncing with her heartbeat. Jonas had walked this exact path. His echo was everywhere, in the shifting breeze, in the subtle misalignment of her reflection, in the unnatural hush that deepened with each step she took. At the center of the clearing, the ground vibrated softly. The temperature dropped with abrupt precision, not gradual like weather, but instant, the kind of cold that belonged to someplace else entirely. And then the world stuttered. Not visually. Not at first. It began with sound. A bird's call elongated unnaturally. Leaves rustled and then froze mid-motion. Isla exhaled, but her breath took a half-second too long to leave her mouth. Time was warping around her, bending the way Jonas had described in his final pages. The air shimmered. A faint blue light flickered at the edge of the clearing. Then another. Then a rippling wave moved outward, like reality stretching thin over a frame. Slowly, painfully slowly, the archway began to appear again. This time, it formed more completely than before. Stones emerged from nothing, etched with worn symbols that pulsed like living veins. The air around it buzzed, thick with energy so old it felt sentient. Isla took a small step forward. The fragment in her hand vibrated, matching the pulsing of the arch. She raised it slightly, and the light within the arch brightened, responding to her presence. To her. As though recognizing her the way it had recognized Jonas. Then she heard him. Isla, his voice was clearer now, layered but desperate. Not a memory. Not an echo. Him. A shape appeared behind the arch, shifting, unstable, like an image caught between frames. Jonas. His outline flickered between eras, one moment illuminated by lantern light from centuries ago, the next washed in the fading hues of the present-day sunset. He reached toward her, and for a second, she saw his face fully, his eyes wide with relief and terror all at once. "Don't step in yet," he cried, his voice fracturing. "It's not stable." The arch convulsed violently, light splitting into fractured beams. The ground trembled beneath Isla's feet. A scream, not human, not physical, seemed to echo from somewhere deep inside the fold. The same presence she'd felt before. The thing that wasn't Jonas. A shape formed beside him, tall, featureless, its outline shifting like liquid shadow. It extended toward the divide, stretching through the layers of time. Isla stumbled backward, heart hammering, breath sharp. Jonas shouted, voice breaking apart, "Isla, run!" But she couldn't move. She could only stare as the fold flexed open wider, light bending inward like a collapsing star, the presence pushing through. Something reached toward her. Not to harm. To pull. To claim. To bring her into the era that had taken Jonas.